That's the thing, right? Like before you do any live broadcast, you always say like, everybody be quiet, be
Yeah.
quiet.
Yeah, I have to give them 15 minutes warning before, they just slow down and
I feel
uh,
that.
well, thank you very much for joining us, Pratik. I really appreciate that you're giving us some of your time, and I'm so honored to have you with us because for those of you who are not familiar with Pratik, he is a high-end, world-class retoucher. You have worked with the biggest names in the photography industry, not only the boudoir industry, but the photography industry. Sue Bryce, Jeremy Coward, McNally, and so many
Mhm.
others. Your work has been featured in so many magazines, Elle,
Yeah.
Marie Claire, GQ, Vogue.
Mhm.
You are a brand ambassador for Phase One. You are an amazing photographer and a great editor. I mean, you have done so many things, and all of them you do it like well. So
Thank you.
super excited to have you with us today. And so one of the things that I would like to ask you first is how many people mispronounce your name?
I think pretty much most people.
Most people.
And yeah, and I've gotten used to it to the point where I don't mind it anymore. It's bad to say because it takes a lot of energy to actually tell people, no, actually it's this. And it makes you look really
Mhm.
sometimes like arrogant or something when you have to correct everyone. And I like it because I also think it's interesting to see the different pronunciations that you can get. And I still get like completely different ones all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's totally fine now.
I used to be there. I used to call you Patrick, which I think a lot of people probably make that mistake instead of Patrick
Yes.
or Patrick,
Yes.
of course. But yeah, so I was reading about you, and one thing that surprised me was that you actually began as a photographer, right? And then
Yes.
and then did a retouch, and then you're back now doing some boudoir and things like that. So when you began as a photographer, what kind of photographer were you? You were a commercial photographer, or tell me a
I
little
did. I did a lot of beauty work primarily in the beginning because
bit.
I was actually very fascinated with the face, just because I really loved connecting with people's emotions. Like for me, when I'm friends with somebody, I really enjoy connecting them with them on a personal level, and I love to see and make them smile and laugh, and an actual connection with someone. You
Yeah,
can tell on their face if they're enjoying it or
right.
not.
Yeah,
And the people who cannot read those cues tend to not understand at what point is somebody tired of talking to you, so they just keep on talking.
yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah.
And I was like, this is a strength actually, to be able to pick out the best emotions from a photo shoot and actually make really good selects based on that. So people kept telling me that that I had a lot of emotions in my photo, and beauty in the beginning was such a fantastic medium for that. But obviously I kind of grew from that too, because beauty takes a long time to actually do a shoot, because you have to wait for the makeup artist, you got to wait for the hairstylist, you have to find the perfect model, because not everyone can do beauty. So I wanted to venture out from that, but that's how I pretty much got started in photography.
And then you began to do, the retouching, and you became so great at it that it kind of like took over your photography work, right?
Yeah, it was weird because I think the time period that we're talking about right now is approximately maybe 15 years ago, roughly speaking. I don't remember exactly when it was, but I remember picking up that first camera that I had back in college. And that was, I would say, maybe 2006 or somewhere like that. And I remember taking photographs, but what I was most compelled about, aside from the photographs, was the post-processing part, and how you could actually manipulate the photograph to kind of tell your own story. And for me, that was such an eye-opening experience, because I didn't know that many people at the time were doing that. I thought that if you were a fantastic photographer, you you did it in the camera and that's it. Like there was nothing else. And I don't know where that mentality came from. Maybe I was listening to a lot of purists on the forums that didn't know how to use Photoshop or something. And for me, I was like, okay, well, I guess if I'm taking bad photos, or if I'm not taking the photos that I see in magazines, clearly I need to just keep revisiting photography. And then I realized, wait a minute, there's a whole world of post-production. And that really just took me by surprise and gave me a bunch of opportunities. And I fell in love with the Photoshop part simultaneously with photography. But what happened was, because of supply and demand at the time, and even now, there isn't too many retouchers out there who can understand what photographers deal with. And because I started connecting with photographers, they started asking me about retouching. And they said, do you take clients, and would you be able to retouch my work? And I loved it. I just started, really enjoying seeing people's raw files and learning from them. Because I was thinking, you know what, if I could do retouching now and get those raw files and study how other photographers are shooting, I could probably, make a short line to being a better photographer. And so my mentality was just that I'm just going to keep on learning from photographers' raw files. And eventually I'm just going to go back to photography. But it never happened for like 10 years.
Wow. So what your plan was then to come back to photography?
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, that's great. And I mean, you do an amazing job. I've
Thank
seen
you very much.
some of your, are you doing now boudoir instead of commercial, or what is your plan?
Yeah, so right now I've transitioned to a lot of boudoir and lingerie fashion, I would say, because I was so inspired by going to camp and seeing like you and Zhao and everyone, and how the industry was a lot different than I had known before. Before I actually came into the group, we didn't have a huge perception of it. Like I was friends with like Jen Rosenbaum and Nino and those guys. So I knew a little bit about it from their experiences, but my world was always the fashion world and the beauty world and the retouching world. But then when I came to this side, I was like, wait a minute, this medium is absolutely perfect because you get to express emotion. You don't have to wait for a makeup artist for one look. You can have a whole like world that you can explore in. And they're your actors almost. And I see that in your work too. And there's just so much like sophistication. And that was actually what kind of drew me in, was, that level.
Yeah. And I think it's great that you're now back as a photographer, because I imagine having your experience retouching photos now, that gives you an edge over what other people are doing. So what are the things that have changed actually from your experience as a photographer at the beginning and now? I imagine you look at things differently, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, what are the things that have changed?
That's such a great question, because I was thinking about that the other day. I was editing some files, and I realized back then, I had my first camera was a Canon XTI. It was a Rebel, and if you're watching from another part of the world, they used to call it the Kiss. I think Kiss something or another, and it was okay. It was fine. I had the kit lens, and I realized that even if you had a really nice lens, you still had to bump up your ISO if you're shooting natural light a lot. And for me, that wasn't even possible, because after say like ISO 200, you could start seeing noise coming to the sensor.
Yeah.
And so back then I wasn't able to kind of explore light the way that I am now, where I could go outside in a really dim lit situation and capture that almost noise free, because with like a wide open lens that you could stop down, and with low light, it's such a clean image. Back then I couldn't do that, but now everything that I see with my eye, I could translate that and then use that as a workable file. So it kind of made me stuck, doing studio work primarily, which was a good thing to do. But I still remember back then thinking, I wish technology would advance to the point where I could live up to the style that I want to live up then. And now it has. Now I shoot wide open because I love shooting that 1.2 kind of aperture, and I love, capturing really dimly lit situations and playing with lamps and candles and things that I really couldn't do to the level that I wanted to before.
Yeah, so I know you shoot with Canon, and
I do,
right?
yeah. I
You
shoot.
have the R.
Yes, yes.
How you like it? I also have that one.
That's right. I know. I love it, just because I think I grew up with Canon, and you did as well, right? Like
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
been
yeah.
with
Me too.
Canon. And so I had the original XTI, then I went to the 5D, and then from the 5D I went to Sony for a little while. But the colors were a bit different for me, and
Yeah.
the ergonomics. I know everyone says, "Oh, it's just you can adjust that in the raw file and all that stuff." But the reality is, as a researcher, I see so many different files from different systems, and I'm more keen to those discrepancies. So for me, I had to pick the camera that only delivered kind of files that I envisioned color-wise, and then also the ergonomics. And so I just loved it. The menu systems, ergonomics, everything has been great. And the lenses, like the RF lenses, for me, are like my favorite lenses out there.
And what is your go-to lens?
I primarily stick with the 50-1.2. It's the RF50. And I tried like the EF 50-1.2 and kind of adapting it, but I noticed like the sharpness wasn't the same as well. And the RF lenses actually surprised me. I remember renting a year and a half ago, I rented the R system and the RF lens, thinking, oh, it's probably going to be good. I want to try the mirrorless out. But what happened was I actually loved the lens even more than the camera. The RF was so sharp, wide open at 1.2. It was almost like it was a sweet spot,
Yeah.
And no matter what aperture you used, it was equally as sharp. So I just fell in love with the lens, and I was like, I have to get this system because of this lens.
Oh, I see. Okay. That's interesting. I use the Canon 50 1.4.
Oh,
It's
yes.
super cheap lens compared to
It's great.
the other one. Yeah, but it's for me, it's a very good use of resources to have, a cheaper lens that is going to provide you, I mean, probably not exactly the same quality, but it's okay.
Yes.
And I love it. But yeah, I have to try that one. I haven't shoot it. Yeah, maybe next time we get together, you can.
Absolutely. The only downside is though, is that even with the lenses being super sharp, the retouching time is a consideration. So if you're working like full-time photographer like yourself,
Yeah,
it might be better not to do that just
that's
because.
right. Yeah.
Yes. I
That's
used to
true.
do that before. When I used to shoot beauty, I used to actually use lenses that were soft
Mm.
because I
It's
didn't really want to retouch all that. And honestly, for Instagram and Facebook, it pretty much looks relatively the same.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, and the other thing is that your style, if you have to put it in this how you say
Like a bubble.
type of style, like light and airy or dark and moody,
Yeah.
you're probably more dark and moody, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, and that's something that for me has because before at the beginning when I was beginning to do boudoir, I was doing light and airy, and
Yeah.
also that's something that um, when I was retouching, it took me a long time because you can see every imperfection in the skin. I mean, it's more like you say, noticeable.
Yeah.
So being dark and moody is probably it lets you convey, or not convey, but kind of diminish or make the imperfections less visible, and that's also great.
Yeah. If you're bad at retouching, just hide most of the skin. It's
Right.
great.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. And it looks awesome. So why not? Right.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. Okay. So one of the other things I wanted to ask you is now that you are doing photography, do you, how long do you spend, retouching an image? I guess it depends on what kind of, for who is the image, or if it's going to be
Sure.
a magazine or,
Yeah.
some other media. But for your work, how much you spend on an image? How much time?
This is going to be such a funny answer because I haven't told anybody this. When it comes to photography, my workflow is different than what most people know me for, like my retouching workflow, in a very interesting way.
Hmm.
The first one is I know that most of the photos that I primarily shoot, they're not for clients or they're not for print per se. They're primarily for web.
Right.
So I actually resize them down to web before I edit them
Mm.
because I can actually get through a lot more photographs if I know I'm not really going to be printing them.
Ah.
And so what happens is when I resize it down to like 2048 pixels, which is what Facebook typically looks for, and it also works for Instagram, I end up saving a lot of time, but also I end up giving a lot of selects back faster so I can shoot more. And so for me, my fun part is obviously retouching, but I want to shoot a lot. So I
Mm.
can do that. And then when it is time to say print a photograph or whatever, I can go back and revisit those files that need to be printed, and it still saves me net so much more time. But obviously, if you're somebody who's doing sessions and you're printing them, different story. I completely understand. But if you're doing personal sessions that you're not going to really print or don't know yet,
Right.
then do that, because your skills in the future will evolve to a point where when it's time to print, you're probably going to do it much better than anyway.
Yeah. And when you're retouching, when do you know when it's time to stop? Because I can spend like
Oh yeah.
5 hours in one single image, right? So, but when is that you say, okay, this is good enough, and
Yeah. You know, the biggest thing that helps people is when you tell them, if you're looking for things to fix in your head going, what else can I do? Then I think you're good. Like, you don't have to keep going after that.
Mm.
If the things are popping out to you like, oh, that needs to be fixed, that needs to be fixed, do those things. But then once those things are done, if you're like wondering, going, okay, let me just keep on going because of habit. And we're the type of, people are like, they have a hard time restraining themselves. So if you keep on doing something, you're going to want to keep doing more of that. And it's really hard cycle to break. And some physical helpers that I use normally is I actually put a lot of grain on a separate layer on top of my image.
Ah.
Because what happens is, when you add grain on top, like as a separate layer, and you work underneath it, it almost prevents you from over analyzing the nuances that are really not going to be seen anywhere else anyway.
Ah.
Yeah, so it's like a
That's,
visual stop gap for me.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting. So
Yeah.
you do that basically. Do you use Lightroom at all, or just Photoshop?
I use Capture One, and then I go to Photoshop.
I see. So
Yeah.
Capture One to do the color kind of fixes, exposure,
Yeah,
that kind of thing, and then go to Photoshop to do the heavy editing.
exactly. And I noticed that Capture One and Lightroom have different color renditions for the files.
Mm.
And also the tools react differently because the algorithms are different. So for example, on Capture One, like, the shadows and highlight recovery,
Mm.
the way the shadows kind of come back in Capture One is different than the way it comes back in Lightroom. And the way the noise is impacted as well, and the color profile. So as a base file, it looks really nice in Capture One. So I tend to do that first, because everything after that is kind of like a bonus then.
Mm. I see. Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I maybe I need to try the phase one thing or the capture
Yeah,
one. Sorry.
and the good thing is it's kind of free. So even if you don't like it, you don't have to use it ever again, but you can use it and see how it kind of works with the same files. That's one of my favorite things to do, is try different programs with the same raw file. Because
Mhm.
it's like, oh, wow, I'm like a better photographer now just because the raw file looks different.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I struggled with when I'm editing. Not too much the retouching, but the color.
Yeah,
Because depending on the color, you can give the image a different feel, right?
right.
So how do you do that? What is your preference, or how do you manage color? I know you have a lot of products related to
Sure,
products
sure.
to color, but how
Yeah.
how do you do it?
It's funny because I would say I'm kind of like yourself, where I really like color in the sense where I appreciate it a lot, but I've always had a hard time with it because my eye tends to notice things like expressions or light and shadow, and how that kind of interacts with the scene. But when it comes to adding color in it, it's kind of a nuisance, because you have to worry about your composition. You got to worry about the balance of light. And then suddenly there's some colors that shouldn't really even be there that just kind of are there, and you can't really fix it. And you're like, damn it, if that thing wasn't there, it would have been great. Or if I could have wrangled that to make it better for me to kind of play with, it
Yeah.
would have been so much easier. But then I'm like, how am I going to do that? So I said, surely there must be a way to make it much easier for me. So as you know, I have a tool called Infinite Color
Yeah.
Panel, which I use now, and we have a bunch of like infinite tools that
Yeah.
do all
I,
kinds of things. But primarily, they're tools that kind of help people give suggestions on what color options there are. And I normally keep color grading to the end of the process. And what I like to do is this Infinite Color Panel, or like Infinite Looks, which are another tools that I have. You run them, and it takes your picture basically, and it gives you color options one by one or multiple at a time. So the reason I did that was, because I didn't really know the direction which to take colors,
hmm.
and this kind of gives me that direction and option, so that I'm like, wait a second, I didn't know my picture could look like that. And then you can play with it and tweak it and make it your own. And that's kind of how I learned color too. So it's a tool that helps me
Hmm.
color grade, but also helps me learn what I like and don't like having a personal shopper for colors.
Yeah. So now with the technology and the things, the tools like yours that you develop that allows people to change their color scheme or the color palette in post.
Mhm.
But you also, when you shoot, do you have any preference in terms of the color palette you use? Do you like to shoot better with, cooler tones or maybe warmer tones? What is your preference?
Yeah, I have noticed that my preference has been really warm tones,
Mm.
and I didn't know that. It was a very subconscious thing. I let my emotions kind of drive the feel that I'm after. I don't really question it because I know that whatever it's telling me, it's kind of my identity. So I like the warmer tones naturally. But in terms of like the color palette of, say, the dress or the scene, I really love neutrals just because they can adapt either way. And I just stay
Mm.
away from bright saturated tones because,
Mm.
again, I don't know how to wrangle that, and it's overwhelming sometimes for me visually.
I see. Okay. That's interesting. It's interesting. It's very interesting to me to hear you say that you care a lot about the emotion your images can deliver,
Yeah,
because I'm the same. I think for me is body language, the emotion, the use of light, and the editing,
yeah.
and that's what makes a style, right?
Mhm.
So very interesting to hear that you have kind of the same thing, right, with
Yeah,
the emotion.
yeah, and you're such. I think one of your biggest strengths for me when I look at yours off the bat is the way that you're able to understand posing.
Mm.
Because my wife, Bella Kotek, she's a fine art photographer, and so for her, her like idea of posing is very particular. Like she must have her hands a certain way, the body language a certain way, and I notice the same kind of principles in your work, and
Mm.
that's where I feel like our genre, even if you call it boudoir or if you call it something else, it's still a form of art because there are these principles from each genre of photography that merged together to form our genre.
Hmm.
And posing is one of those elements where you have to also understand. It's not just how does your face look, it's what emotion is your body conveying and what does that mean? It's such an abstract concept,
Yeah.
but you portray that so well. I'm so glad you teach that and show that off,
Hmm.
because when it comes to posing, I think you do such a great job of eloquently kind of breaking it down why this leg needs to be there, especially like with your posing guide. That
Yeah.
was the opening thing for me. It was like, wow, I had no idea that these little things had meanings with these nuances.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that coming from you. It's a great compliment. But yeah, what I think for us photographers, because we don't have other ways to maybe enhance the communication between our work and our audience. We don't
Mhm.
have sounds or smells or movement like a film, for example. We
Yeah.
have to rely on these things that we can control, like body language and expression in your face, like you were mentioning before, right? Our faces express a lot of emotion, especially our eyes and our mouth.
Yeah.
So we have to work with that, in my opinion, with that real estate as much as we can to be able to deliver the emotions or the message that we want to deliver with our work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you just gave me a thought actually that even though you can't hear a photo, just based on the pattern that the face is making, you know what that feels like or looks like. Because as kids, if we didn't hear like an auditory response, like if your mom was angry at you, you'd hear something and then you'd see the expression. So automatically you associate that expression with the sound.
Mm.
And if let's say that we were born but we couldn't physically associate a sound to an expression, would we really know what that expression meant? And I think expression is such a universal language
Right.
just because the personal experiences that we have based on seeing someone and what they're making and the reaction that we have towards that expression.
Mm. Yeah, I never thought about that, but
Yeah.
that makes sense. That makes
So
sense.
then what happens if somebody, maybe there's a culture where like a particular expression means something else completely different. And so they're looking at a photo going, wow, that's such a happy photo, but you meant to make it so like emotional.
Yeah, I don't know. It will be interesting to see an experiment, right? To see uh, how different would that be. That will be weird,
Like in
right?
some cultures, maybe someone's laughing if they're sad or something. I don't know.
Could be. I don't know. That's very interesting. I never thought about that. That could be. That's funny. Okay, so other thing I wanted to ask you. Let me read here because I made some notes. Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you. In your experience, um, what will be a good advice that you can give to people to be faster, editing photos? What is the thing that you could, if you have known before, you could have used, early in your careers as a retoucher that will, make things faster?
Hmm. I The first thing is always have a game plan before you begin working because if it's like it's like going to the groceries when you're hungry. You're gonna buy a lot more food than you anticipated, for sure. Like I do that all the time. I did that the other day. I was like, I'm just gonna go and pick up the two things I look for. I was like, wait a second, I had never seen those flavor of chips before. I'm just gonna pick them up real quick. It's fine. It's no big deal. And so retouching is kind of the same, where you really have to figure out what you're gonna do before you do it. So I always before I used to mark up photos. So for instance, I would open the photograph, add a new layer, and then start drawing on the layer and be like, okay, that needs to be fixed, that needs to be fixed. And then once I did those things, I would kind of look at it going, how does it look? And I was like, wow, it looks still natural. So I said, great, let me just stick to the game plan. And when I did, it looked really clean and nice. But the problem becomes when you don't have that game plan and you start removing things and you're like, okay, your brain automatically goes, what else am I going to fix? Because you're in Photoshop already and that's where you fix photos. But the reality is that's not, it's such a trap. So you have to make a plan and then go for it. That's like the biggest thing. If you do that, I promise you, it sounds really simple, but you're going to save so much time just by having an idea what you're going to do before you do it and sticking to it.
And do you have any special kind of keyboard or
Mm.
gadgets that you use?
I use a Wacom tablet,
Yeah.
a graphic tablet. That's my number one thing. I would not recommend using like a trackpad or a mouse. If you can, try to transition over. I know a lot of people do use a mouse, and that's fine. I use the mouse in the beginning, but transitioning over has sped up time for sure, 100%. I take that for granted. I almost forgot about it, but definitely a Wacom tablet. And also, I don't have any separate gadgets that I use because I travel a lot. So if I get reliant on another gadget and I don't have it when I'm traveling, it's really annoying. So I just make sure that my keyboard shortcuts are set up.
Mm.
And the way that I do that is all the tools that I mostly use, I put them to one side of the keyboard just because if I can access those in one key without looking down, it's incredible. It's almost like let's say you're browsing through a bunch of files on your computer and you have bookmarks and you go to those bookmarks because, they're easily accessible on one location. But if you don't have bookmarks, you have to manually go through your files and access them. It takes a while. So shortcuts really almost like bookmarks where you can immediately click on them and you're there. And it makes the efficiency so much faster and much more pleasant to use. Less mental strain for sure.
Yeah. I agree. I also use a lot of shortcuts when I'm in Photoshop. I create my own and
Oh,
have it.
nice.
Yeah. And so I noticed that that helped a lot.
What
Uh,
shortcuts do you like to use?
well, for example, for Liquify,
Yeah.
I do Shift Command X.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the Control V and Control C, Control S for save, and to change from Lightroom to Photoshop is like Command E, and
Um,
so some others. But yeah, I mean, I think instead of going with the mouse and click on the thing, and it's so much faster to do the
mm.
keyboard.
I do agree. And if you're new to Photoshop and you're just getting used to it, I would recommend definitely learning the program first before you dive into just shortcuts. And I say that because I recently started learning 3D and I was like in the mentality of I need all the shortcuts. So while I was trying to learn the program, I was also trying to memorize the shortcuts, thinking, shoot, I can't use that tool till I press the shortcut. What was that shortcut? And it just made it so tiring. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to learn the program first, then I'll come back and use the shortcuts. And that's what I recommend for people. Otherwise, you might get really overwhelmed. So,
Oh, I see.
yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. And what do you think about now that, because I mentioned Liquify, a lot of photographers, a lot of boudoir photographers are against using Liquify to do some of the work. What do you think about that? What is your position?
I think if you're somebody who really respects like body positivity and somebody who works with clients who are kind of in the same boat as you in your same ethos, I think that's great. Like I would love to see a world where you can kind of do that and be accepted for it, or not even have people ask for it anymore, because the intention of Liquify isn't just to make people skinny, but in the fashion world, for example, we actually use Liquify to make people bigger now, even more than before. We get requests saying, this area of the body, could you make it look bigger? Because as you know, with lens choices, what happens sometimes is based on the angle of the arm, it could make body parts distorted. Not because they are that way, but because the pose and the muscle contractions and the angle accentuates things that don't represent themselves. So what we do is we use Liquify to change it to represent their real character. And I know it gets a bad rap. So there's many ways of using Liquify. And another way is accentuating clothes and lines. So if, for example, you're wearing a dress and it's flopping over a certain way that looks very strange and doesn't accentuate the real you, we kind of adjust the clothing to fit the body and to have a nice flow so it's not distracting. And so for me, Liquify is such a widely used tool that I think is beyond just making people skinny. And I want people to know that because, you know, like, for example, you probably know the same. It's very important to use it, but also to have boundaries set that don't cross your morals or the morals of your client and what you're trying to deliver.
Absolutely. No, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I honestly don't use it too. I don't use it very much. But if the client asks me to change, something, I'll do it. Like I had
Yeah.
clients that, just had their baby, and they say make my tummy 3 times smaller. And so, okay. And yeah, I mean, because boudoir is really a kind of like a fantasy, right? And
Yeah,
want to look themselves uh, the way they want, right? It's
that's
a
true.
fantasy. So yeah, I grant that fantasy. May your wishes come true. Boom, liquify.
It's definitely like fine art, you know. It's almost like back in the day when they used to do the fine art paintings, they would have the subjects, you know, sit there for them. But because there was no like retouching, they were kind of retouching in real life
Mm,
because
yeah.
they wanted their portraits to look fantastic. So they would paint them like them, but
Mm,
also a bit better, so
mhm.
that future generations could be like, wow, their skin is so porcelain and so smooth and they don't have knuckles. Fun fact, if you go to a museum next time, look at fingers. They minimize knuckles. They barely have them in paintings.
Ah,
And that's the biggest request I get for beauty photography is minimize knuckles. I don't know
really?
why. People really hate knuckle lines, I
Oh,
guess.
wow. Really?
Yeah.
That's weird. I never heard about that. Really?
Yeah.
And so does the same thing happen with like elbows and knees?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. Any area that the skin is bunched up that changes transition really quickly, they
Mm.
want that evened out. Which is why if you look at any like high-end photograph, look at the transition of texture. Don't look at retouching. Just look at what is the texture across the image. Is there any areas that have just a jarring texture profile? And you'll notice they don't. It's all symmetrical and the transitions are nice intentionally. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. I mean, yeah, that's weird. Okay, there's
Everyone's gonna
something.
want to edit their knuckles. They'll tell you like, okay, you know, keep the size, keep the whatever. Knuckles, smooth mount.
Hmm. That's fascinating. Okay, so Tell me now more a little about your products. I know you have so many, you know, the infinite tools, or the infinite radiance, textures, infinite
Yeah.
color. Yeah. So tell me a little, you know, how can people find these things and how can they help with their work?
Of course, yeah. For me, the biggest thing has always been efficiency in my workflow and also tools that really are useful for me. And what I realized was Photoshop, there was grand ideas I had for, oh, Photoshop is probably going to release this in the future. And I was waiting for it for a very long time. And then so I said, what if we just go out and kind of create these things that are actually usable for people and they're not just gimmicks? And things that I would use and I do use in my own workflow for professional clients and commercial work. And so our main website is infinite-tools.com,
Mhm.
and that is going to be where our current and most recent products are going to be. Now, the premier product that I have is Infinite Color Panel, which is the main one that started everything.
Mhm.
That still is residing on the main website, which is infinitecolorpanel.com. And so we decided to do that because with Infinite Tools, it's going to be hosting everything.
Mhm.
And so on Infinite Tools, we have a few products. Primarily, the first one we did was Infinite Texture. And texture is very interesting because we have a lot of photographers in our community that do composites, whether it's adding elements like smoke and flare and
Mhm.
just window light coming through and just things that would enhance the scene. And so textures, things for things like that. It's for things like adding digital backdrops behind photographs. So if you shoot against a plain wall but want a hand painted backdrop, you can put that in there and you can do all kinds of things. We can add elements like actual props, different kind of birds, light leaks, and everything you kind of think of that is related to texture in multiple categories
Mhm.
is there. And it has artificial intelligence so that if you find a texture you like, but you kind of want something similar, the AI knows to find other similar textures to help
Mhm.
you find other things. And there's literally tens of thousands of them in the program for
Oh.
like 179 or something around there based on what sales going on, so that you have unlimited license for every one of them. So you don't have to worry about license fees or anything like that. And it's really cool. You can save favorites. You get suggestions from us based on what cool new things we've added, and it's really nice. And then from there, we've done a bunch of other things. Like another one that I'm really excited about that we did was Infinite Radiance,
Mhm.
and we realized we're doing so much with color. Like, what about luminosity? You know, like what about the balance of light across the image? And so Radiance is a tool that helps you change the depth of colors. So let's say the primary colors of an image are red, green, and blue,
Mhm.
which are the channels of an image. What if you could keep, you know, the overall luminosity relatively the same, but maybe darken the reds and increase the blues? So you're shifting like the balance of light across the image. Because what tends to happen is, you know, we capture this image, it's the composition is great, but the balance is a little bit off. You know, the balance is a little bit off. Maybe I wish the warmth, the yellows of the light were a little bit brighter. And so what happens is the yellows will warm up, but the blues will go down. So
Mhm.
luminosities will shift. And
Mhm.
it's such a trippy effect when you see it. It's really hard to explain because it does it in such a intelligent way. But go to the website and check out the video on Radiance because it changes the entire balance of the composition. And you're like, man, I like that a lot better. And so you end up discovering a whole new photograph that doesn't alter your colors. So, you know,
Mhm.
we have that as well. And then there's a bunch of other things that we're coming out with, like evening out skin tones, which is going to be coming out
Yeah, yeah, I saw it.
very soon. That's going to be great because you could do everything, whether it's skin tones or whether it's like maybe the grass that you're shooting on had like brown patches and you want to quickly even that out. And so you're able to unify all the tones for whatever it is that you're looking for. So maybe the skin tones have reds and yellows, the feet's a little bit desaturated, whatever.
Mm.
You could use this tool and it makes a map for you and kind of evens out the skin nicely. It
Mm.
makes all colors like uniform. So all kinds of
That'll be
fun stuff.
great. Would that fix tan lines, for example?
It will fix tan lines in the sense of color, but like lighting and stuff, you still have to manually kind of
Ah,
even that out. But once that's done, it's incredible like how much it changed makes it so much easier for me to like just get a consistent clean image.
right. That'll be great. And when is that coming out?
It's supposed to be coming out this week and at the time of
Mm,
the recording approximately in the beginning of September.
cool. I would love to have that. I'm gonna leave the links, all the links for your work, for your products, below and in the website as well, so people can
Awesome.
access
Thank
it.
you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And yeah, that's great. I'll ask you about if you have any workshops coming soon or not.
I would say I'm planning it. I haven't done any in stone just yet. Obviously, there's the retouching series platform. In case everyone wants to learn online, they can go there and they can check all the videos. But I really love doing in-person ones,
Yeah,
and I want to do one again in the future once things get a little bit better. So
right.
that's on
Yeah,
my agenda.
right. Yeah, with this COVID situation, things are weird.
Yeah,
I also, yeah.
it's good though because like also it's given us a chance to kind of catch up on things that we've been meaning to do,
Mm,
or really get us to think what can we do to adapt ourselves as creatives. And you're a good example of that because when you started the group that you have on Facebook,
this
um
one.
that's the one. Yes, it's such a good incentive, and I
Ah,
think I'm excited to see what you do with the community, and it's such a nice positive space.
yeah, thank you. No, and it's great that photographers like you are part of the group. I think it adds a lot of value to the people, and these conversations, I think, also give people different points of view and gives them something to think about, and
Yeah.
ways they can change the way they're doing things and improve as photographers too. So thank you very much for thank you very much thank you very much for joining, Pratik. Super glad that you agreed to do this interview, and I'm gonna leave the links to your products. And yeah, I don't think is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I just want to say thank you as well because the photography journey recently has been such a relatively, I would say, new experience. And although it's been already like a year and a half or something, which is crazy to think about,
Mm.
and in photography, time flies. So I appreciate you giving me the chance to talk about it and open up to your community and audience. And I hope to kind of connect with a lot of people in this community going forward too.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and see you later.
All right, see y'all. Take care.